My name is Bojan Simic. I'm the co-founder and CTO of a cybersecurity startup that does authentication called Hyper, based in New York City. I know that we are in an oven right now, and that I am the only thing keeping you away from the bar right after this. So what I'm going to do is, keep it short, answer your questions that you care about, and, get everybody a drink. So the talk is titled Centralized Passwords. They are a hacker's dream. Why are we using them? And this is, if you were in the last talk, this is actually a great kind of shift in terms of context, because this provides more of the architectural change that needs to happen on the back end rather than just the mobile part of it. So let's start with the doom and gloom. Right? That's what every cybersecurity talk should start with, because we're all a bunch of miserable people. So the fact is, we're in the era of the Big Bang breach. Right? So every once in a while you read an article, maybe you work at one of these companies, where tens of millions of your users have been affected at once. If you're at Yahoo, it's billions. And you have a really bad day. It's a career-altering type of event, and nobody likes these. But the numbers are scary. So every minute, 5,000 passwords are lost or stolen. There's 10 times more account takeover fraud in 2018 and 2017. This is because everybody's moving things that were traditionally inside the firewall to the cloud. And those 5,000 passwords that are stolen every second are now weaponized against those targets that are wide open for everybody to attack. So, and the credential stuffing rates are getting better and better. You can actually get them up to 4% in some instances if you just put the domain of the company right in front of the password. So like Yahoo password one helps a lot of people. And it's incredibly easy to weaponize these attacks and mount them. There's a database I downloaded last week that contains 600 million passwords. And my 12-year-old nephew can weaponize them against any company and have a pretty good success rate with like 0 resources. But let's look at the root of the problem. The root of the problem is passwords, but I like to take it a step further and talk about shared secrets in general. So shared secrets are passwords. They're one-time passwords, or more importantly, the seeds that are used to generate those one-time passwords. And those types of approaches to authentication in general. So what we end up with is this architecture where everybody's authenticating against some system. And that system might be federated, which is great. But that one system has everybody's credentials in it. And sure, they might be hashed, they might be salted. It might be really hard to create a rainbow table or some other thing to crack those. But a lot of times, you don't even need to crack them if you have broken into that system, because you can just download 600 million passwords in an hour. So when you have this architecture where you have this central target within an organization, this is the hacker's primary target. This is what they're going after. This is what they're targeting. This is what actually enables credential stuffing, account takeover, all those things. And it's what enables phishing and all our favorite types of attacks that are really low-hanging fruit, right? There's a reason like 80% of breaches are due to lost or stolen passwords. It's easy stuff. So why are we still using this concept of shared secrets, right? We've been using passwords and shared secrets really for 50 years. So over the last 50 plus years, we've kind of taken this thing that was really any network back then or any system back then was trusted. I mean, people trusted these systems because they could lock them with a key, and you had to get a key to open the door to get into the system. And this is when passwords were first originated. And over the last 50 years, we've kind of taken this thing that is fundamentally flawed to begin with, and we've just bolted stuff on top of it. So we've taken RSA tokens, bolted them on top. We've taken SMS two-factor authentication, bolted it on top, also relies on shared secrets. Now we use phone as a token. That also relies on shared secrets. And so what we've done is we've now got this giant mountain of stuff that's built on top of the password, and we've got 50 years of infrastructure and software and everything else that relies on it. And it's really hard to move away from it. So how do we actually solve this? And it's not easy, right? Companies like Ping, other vendors here, other organizations have been putting millions of dollars and tons of manpower into solving this issue because it's the most important one in our space, I think. But if you could come up with a solution, the solution is, and it would be, to remove the target. So you have this centralized thing that has everybody's credentials that anybody can target, anybody can try to authenticate against it, and the solution is to remove the target. And what that really means is, from a technical perspective, use public key cryptography everywhere for authentication all the time, right? Easier said than done, but it's actually possible now. I'll talk about why. So if you remove the target, you move the keys to the person's, let's say, mobile device, because everybody has one, you do a lot of awesome things. So you don't have any more shared secrets that people can try against. Does this work? Yep. All right. You move the keys to a user's device. And this type of approach is immune to credential stuffing, immune to phishing that targets credential harvesting, and prevents all these nasty things from happening. And fundamentally, what we're doing is we're taking the solution by going from an architecture that is centralized, fundamentally really expensive to defend. So we spent like 30 years building the walls higher around this thing. And we're moving it to an architecture that's really expensive to attack, but inexpensive to defend. Because now, if you're using public key cryptography everywhere, your server that everybody's authenticating to just has a bunch of public keys. And those are public. So you don't have to spend tens of millions of dollars defending it necessarily, because there's no shared secrets. So how is this supposed to work? I'm gonna talk about 3 primary reasons that this is possible today and wasn't possible 10 years ago. So reason number 1, everybody's got a smartphone now. If you have a smartphone, it's got different types of biometrics it can support. It's got face recognition, fingerprint recognition, all this cool stuff that we didn't have even 10 years ago. So that's one reason that we can do this now. 2 is open standards. So we have open standards now that people in this room can rally behind. I myself am part of the FIDO Alliance. I'm on the board. I've been involved there for over 5 years now. And some of the stuff that it's provided is really awesome. So it's actually got a framework for us to use to provide strong authentication that is phishing resistant, man-in-the-middle resistant. And it's something that we can deploy alongside what we already have without having to rip and replace 30 years of infrastructure necessarily. And third, I think most important, is security. So these devices that we have in our pockets now, they've been around for 10, 11 years. About 5 years ago, all the device manufacturers, all the equipment manufacturers started doing something really cool, which is they actually started putting isolated environments on these devices that can secure keys and do cryptographic functions outside the core operating system. So think about it. What we're fundamentally doing with this approach is we're going from a centralized system to a decentralized system where keys are on the user's device. Hackers are smart, man. They're going to figure it out. So what's going to happen once they start targeting people's mobile devices with malware and other types of attacks? You have to make sure that those keys, those cryptographic primitives, are done in a separate environment from the rich operating system that is susceptible to malware and viruses and et cetera. So I think these 3 things are what make it actually possible today. And how it works is using this challenge response mechanism, public-private key-based approach, where on the left here you have the user's client. And that client could be their mobile device. It could be their YubiKey. It could be a laptop that they've acquired that supports FIDO. And every single time the user authenticates, they're issued a different challenge, which means every single authentication request is unique. And when they sign that challenge using a private key that they have on their phone, they're able to authenticate to a server by matching it with the public key that's stored there. And what this really does for organizations that do this is it makes every single authentication request unique. If you're able to intercept it, you can't replay it. And it makes it phishing resistant. So this ecosystem is here today. You can buy laptops, desktops off the shelf. You can buy mobile devices off the shelf. You can buy hardware tokens off the shelf that support this protocol, this standard out of the box. And this is really awesome with regards to like FIDO, because if I had come here 3 years ago and asked 10 people, how many of you know what FIDO is? Maybe 3 would. But today, everybody does, which is awesome, which shows us that the open standards-based approach is working. It shows us that we can rally behind an open authentication standard just like we did with Federation and SAML, because that's the next logical step. We went from an environment where we have to remember many passwords for many things to now we remember one password for many things, and now we can get rid of the password entirely. It's the next logical step in our space. And the business outcomes are really great. So on the consumer side of things, you can do this for both consumers and employees. On the consumer side of things, you can really provide a great user experience. That's what it's all about. People want the easy button, right? But you can also protect people from themselves. You can protect them from being phished. And you can also protect the organization from having so many password reset requests. So we worked with one customer that had millions of password reset requests every year because it was the type of application where people only use the application once or twice a year. And when they went with this approach, you know, those $17 a pop password reset calls to the call center largely went away, which justifies the initiative. On the consumer side, you know, obviously you can prevent phishing and credential type of breaches, but you can also prevent password reset costs to the help desk. You know, so I actually talked to one bank, and they were telling me about some of the headaches that they have with regards to password resets, and they said, overall, the average employee at this bank spends 24 to 36 hours a year dealing with passwords, either typing them in, resetting them, or getting them changed when they forget them, or just having to change them every 90 days. That's a huge cost. You multiply that by 200,000 employees. That's a lot of money, a lot of wasted time. This approach is also helping organizations accelerate their cloud deployment strategies. Because if you're hesitant to take things that are traditionally inside the firewall protected and putting it outside where anybody can try to access it, if that system uses passwords, that's pretty risky. But if you get rid of the password, if you have this strong authentication mechanism required to access those systems, it's no longer susceptible to phishing or credential reuse or credential stuffing or any of those things. So it's actually a great first step, or one of the first steps for companies who want to move everything to the cloud to take this approach because they reduce their risk. So I'd love to take any questions. I'll also be around tomorrow and today if anybody has. Yeah.
Not necessarily a question, it's just something to add to this. Is that you have a development organization that's developing a product, and they need to spend time a password testing and hardening. All of that essentially goes away. You can use that bandwidth to advance the product.
Yeah, I mean, think about how many penetration tests you've had done on your products in the organization, and think about how many of those findings. Oh, the question, it wasn't a question, it was more of a statement. The statement was, there's a lot of development effort. Development teams put a lot of time and energy into securing the password-based authentication flows, which are very expensive and time-consuming. And so I want to add on to that a little bit, which is, if you look at the majority of the time when you do a penetration test, especially on a new product, there's like 1 or 2 findings that are password related, right? And there's also time associated with fixing those and keeping those up to date and everything else. Yes?
Yeah, so just curious, how do you deal with unmanaged devices? You've got to have a way, I assume, to get those private keys on devices. So how do you handle that?
So this is perfect for BYOD type of situations because it's the public key or the private keys that are stored on the device are stored in the isolated environment on that device. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a corporate managed device. I assume that's your question. This is actually very good for BYOD because you actually are now using a strong method of authentication for the employee without having to put them in a situation where they may have an unmanaged device where they're typing their corporate password into it, right? Because a lot of times companies really push for mobile device management because, hey, this person's putting in their AD password into this phone. But if they're never putting in a credential themselves, then that problem kind of goes away. Yes?
Since the private keys live in the hardware, and say if users now trading their phones, and the hardware key store cannot be exported, that's still going to be generating admin interactions. And how do you guys, do you guys have a separate hardware device or a desktop agent to help with that? Or?
So, classic question, I have a private key on this thing. What happens if I lose it? Or I have a private key on my YubiKey. What happens if I lose it? You have to re-register, right? And this is up to whoever you work with to provide you with a mechanism to do that securely. So the answer is you don't export the private key, you generate a new key pair. You have to reprove who you are and then register a new key pair with that system. Right now, we're basically, a lot of times, we're proving who we are by typing in a password to begin with, which isn't really that secure, right? So that problem needs to be solved as well. The problem that I'm talking about solving here is once the person is on the system, what prevents the bad guys from accessing their accounts? Yes?
As you begin to decentralize the usage of passwords and you move away from that single point of failure, how do you prevent that benefit from being outweighed by the cost of defending distributed systems with unknown operating systems or applications on them from private key theft with tools like Mimikatz and other ones that have come out more recently?
Yeah, so a lot of those tools a lot of those tools that are used to steal private keys are doing it because people's key management is broken to begin with, right? So you have an Android app or something, and it's just kind of storing the private key in a shared preferences file or something, where if I get root access to the device in any way, shape, or form, I can extract those keys. So those tools are taking advantage of insecure practices that companies are using to secure private keys. So that is absolutely something that needs to change, and that's because companies really haven't traditionally needed to do that, especially in a complex environment like mobile devices and other types of systems.
So can we drive adoption of something like this without those primitive things like private key protections and storage being fixed first?
So it depends on the level of assurance that you need for your application, right? If you have a mission critical application that is, that has to be very much secured, then you want to enforce those systems to use authentication mechanisms that are properly storing private keys. But if you have a recipe sharing app or something, I don't think it matters. This gentleman in the back.
In OpenID world, you have a device registration and PKCE. Does this replace those to get the refresh token? I mean, what I see here is you don't need to do refresh token if you have to use FIDO authentication.
Well, that's kind of that's an argument in the space, right? Of where how do you get a refresh token, and do you require another strong authentication to get the refresh token? And I would again say that really depends on the application, right? So if my old token expires, even if my refresh token cannot be used for whatever reason, maybe I do need to do another strong authentication. But I would say yes. It's much when you have a definitive proof that the person is who they say they are, because the only way they could have authenticated is by using a private key that's stored in a hardware isolated environment, then that necessity does kind of have a lesser impact.
If we already have mobile device with the device registration already done, if we want to implement FIDO, how do we have to re-register all the devices?
Yeah, so once you deploy this solution to begin with, users typically need to enroll. And when they're enrolling, it depends on the policy, which authenticators you've enabled for those users. So if, let's say, you wanted to enroll people in fingerprint, face recognition, and voice recognition, then they would have to do the enrollment at that particular point in time, or just using a decentralized PIN, as we call it, which that stays on that application and is relative to just that application.
Hi. So oh. Okay. This protocol has to be implemented on each application, or it goes on top of like a middleware?
Yeah, it's middleware typically. So you'll see a lot of companies who want to do this, and they already have a ping, Okta, ForgeRock, or any of the identity access management, any of the federation products, and they'll bolt this on top of it,
Okay.
so they don't have to use. So like ping, right, allows you to create authentication plugins, and this could be an authentication plugin into that.
Okay.
Okay. Anybody else? Yep.
So I think you're completely right. This is some of the things you talk about as far as like just needing to distribute, you know what I'm saying, our security and not necessarily have single points of failure. So have you guys given any thought to, like, it's obviously there's solutions in the market like around multi-party computation that no longer allow even the single device of the user to be a failure for even one identity, but actually distribute that key across, a centralized server and the device? Is that something you guys have looked into at all? Or I guess pros and cons maybe?
So I've looked at multi-party computation. I actually implemented a version of it when I was much younger. I wrote a Bitcoin wallet that is available on the App Store, if anybody's into that. And that used multi-party computation to create a key, and then I would split the shares and then be able to retrieve the original. But that approach really doesn't fit with the open standards approach, which is what companies want, right? Because if you're a big company and you want to deploy a system that is mission critical and applies to everybody, you want it to be open standards based, which means that FIDO is really the solution in this case. That's my personal opinion of it. I think it's a pretty cool tech, but I think that one of the appeals of open standards based approaches is that you can switch vendors in and out if you need to. You can you can check a lot of boxes from a regulatory perspective as well. I think that's all the time we have. I'll be around if you have any other questions.